Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my Women in Translation video for 2021. So August is Women in Translation Month, which was started by Maytal Rudzinski. She's a blogger. She noted a dearth of women writers being translated into English and decided to bring attention to this phenomenon by creating a month to celebrate the writing of women in translation. It's been going on for a few years. I'll link to Maytal's information down below, but since then, literary sites have taken off. You know, there's lots of reading lists every year put out by websites, and on BookTube we have Matthew Sharapa and Kendra Winchester and Janet, insert literary pun here. They do a yearly readathon. So I'll link to their videos too. I'm kind of excited because I've kind of following one of their two prompts. Because their first prompt was to read something that is not a novel for Women in Translation Month, and I have done that by reading Jhumpa Lahiri's memoir, basically, of learning Italian. Of course, their other prompt was to read something that was translated from a language that you've never read from before, and I have summarily failed on that count, having read Jhumpa Lahiri books translated from Italian and otherwise only books translated from Hebrew, and those are both languages I predominantly read from if I'm not reading from English, or I should say I read the translation from. I also feel a little off this year because on this video and this month I privileged these two books by Jhumpa Lahiri. They're in translation, but Lahiri herself is an American writer and relatively well known in literary circles because she won the Pulitzer Prize. So I'm not exactly bringing representation to the unknown masses here, but I'm speaking to my own reading tastes that I have wanted to read Lahiri's memoir since it came out a few years ago, and then her most recent novel, her first in almost a decade, came out a couple months ago. And it's an interesting turn for her, this turn into Italian writing. It's very different for what she was known for before, writing in English primarily about Indian Americans and Indians like her and her family. More than that, her language has changed significantly. I don't just mean that she's writing in a new one, but she was really well known for being lush and lyrical, and her short stories contained worlds within themselves. She won the Pulitzer for her short story collection, The Interpreter of Maladies. Whereas she talks specifically, in other words, her memoir, about how, of course, her writing in Italian is a lot more simplistic because she doesn't have those synapses from childhood, and even though she's been studying Italian for 20 years, it doesn't come as naturally to her. So that's why, I mean, it became obvious to me in a Captain Obvious sort of way, of course that's why her writing will have changed, or the way that I'll read the English translation will have changed. So it's really interesting because I guess that this is a different sort of translation. It's like translating yourself and translating your life. I read these two books basically back to back, even though they were technically written at least a few years apart, I believe. But it's easy to sort of compare them to each other. They're very similar in size. They're very small books. They're told in this vignette style and kind of in a distant style, I think. She has her vignette chapters about what it is to learn a language, and she talks in this book about her family a little bit because she lived in Italy for a while with her family, but she never really, names them or gives them any sort of personality or character because they're very much background to her and her journey. And then in this, her novel, which came out this year, Whereabouts, she's writing from the point of view of an unnamed woman who very deliberately doesn't have a family. Well, she has parents, and I feel like inevitably, as these vignettes go on, we actually do get a little bit of dimension with this person's relationship with her parents. I guess Lahiri couldn't completely stay away from it. But otherwise, this is completely, untethered, really. I mean, everything is so vague. I mean, we know that this woman is living in an Italian city, but we don't know which one. And I mean, the dialogue is even clunky in an attempt to try and stay away from any sort of specificity. And I have to admit, I don't really like the turn she took in this book. her focus being so vague and so plotless. Plotless to the point where I feel like it circles around to the things I dislike most about like two-dimensional genre fiction, where the characters are one-dimensional, because how can this character be anything else? She's so vaguely written. I mean, these vignettes are literally titled like "At the Supermarket" or "In My Bed," and there's these fleeting notions usually of her observing somebody that she doesn't even know, or if she is observing a relationship in her life, usually it's as fleeting as the people she doesn't know. She's kind of like a vessel for language and thought, and for the most part that's about it. And I can't help but think, with comparing these two books, maybe more than I ought to, about how, Lahiri turned to learning Italian because it was so unconnected from the rest of her life, really. I mean, it was connected to her studies in Renaissance architecture in school, but she had no familial ties to Italy, and she had no personal geographic ties to Italy. Like, the way she knows English is because she grew up in English-speaking countries, and she knows Bengali because her family is Bengali. And Italian, on the other hand, is completely foreign to her. And I think part of the reason she really embraced it is that she could be like herself and make her own sort of decisions, where she felt like stuff was imposed on her with English and with Bengali. And I wonder if that's part of the reason, other than perhaps a lack of complex proficiency in the language, of why she chose such a vague book to write about, where, it's just a vaguely Italian city and a vaguely Italian person living in it, rather than a lush cultural place. I'm speaking as an Italian American, thinking of my own family who lives there with, connections and, beliefs and, just tethers and ties, and how this character is so different than anyone I personally know in Italy, because she's just like a wisp on the wind. And I wonder if Lahiri kind of liked that to a certain degree, to be untethered from the expectations of heritage, which is perhaps the most interesting rumination to come out of this book. There's also a lot about just language and the power of learning language, and I always feel like I should gravitate more toward that. I have trouble with linguistics, and I feel like I gravitate more toward culture, but I also know that those two things are interlinked. Though I feel like, at least in what Lahiri is writing, she's not writing a lot about culture in these books. She's only writing about language and the effect of learning a language. So yeah, my general consensus would be I don't think these two books, and probably especially the novel, would be for most people. I spoke in my Goodreads review, and by the way, I'll link to both of my Goodreads reviews for both of these books down below, but I spoke in my Goodreads review of this book about how plotless it is, and how back in college, speaking of, growing as a reader in this case, I used to love the idea of stream of consciousness, of a lack of plot, because it felt more true to life and more real, because there's so much, scripted nature to most fiction. And that often isn't true to life, where there's like neat little bows. But I coming away from that notion for a few reasons. First of all, it's just not compelling to read about something so plotless, where I feel like it's so plotless that the characters, which are my primary interest in storytelling, are also very flat. And second of all, I don't necessarily believe anymore that life is so unstructured. I mean, it's not quite as formulaic as most fiction can tend to be, but we do have structure in our lives. We do focus on work projects or family troubles, and they take us through a narrative arc such as it is, so that we're not just, in these little vignettes of, oh, I'm just thinking about this, and oh, I'm thinking about that, and there's nothing else going on in my life. So yeah, I don't know. I can't help but think I'm going to still stick with Lahiri, even though I'm not a huge fan of the turn she's taking with this stuff, but I still really like her a lot as a writer. Especially her earlier books, how she wrote, but also what she wrote about in terms of like this sort of alienation that she wrote about in her earlier fiction that kind of reminded me of like, having a foreign culture in America, which for me would be my Jewish culture. And then it is weird for her to be so invested in Italian language in Italy, because I also have a vested cultural familial interest in Italy. So I do still feel a weird sort of pull to her. I mean, I could take it even further and mention that I have a friend whose parents ran in the same circle with her parents, so, but that's taking it a bit far. There's all sorts of reasons to want to stick with a writer, I suppose, in their journey, and even if you don't necessarily connect with them on every step of the way. And I guess I could wax poetic about how it's all sort of a manner of translating a writer's life into a reader's life, but that's probably taking things a bit far. But I'm still glad that Women in Translation Month gave me the excuse to finally, well, sit down with this book, which has been on my TBR forever, and then pick up this one too before I should ship it off to my mother, who is also a big Lahiri fan, so we'll see what she thinks. So that about covers it for me now. Thanks for sticking with me through this odd little video. I hope that all of you participating in Women in Translation Month are finding interesting things to take out of your reading. You can find me back here on this channel in the next couple of days to do my next Friday Reads video, so stay tuned. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.